I've been following the Stop Killing Games initiative for quite some time now. I wasn't quite sure whether or not I would be doing a video on it. If only because I think there are people far more qualified or knowledgeable about the topic already having discussions and videos, right? And so I wasn't really going to make a video about it, but I did see where there's been an update from Ross speaking before the European Parliament, and I think at this stage, despite the progress that he's made, this conversation is still very much only happening within our small circle, the gaming circle, and the wider public. Particularly the normies who claim to love games are not really talking about it and not interested in it because it's not something that's trending. So I just figured it's a good idea to give as much visibility to it, and listen to what Ross has to say here, and maybe what the response is that he may be getting in the room there, because I think it's dawned on all of us that people in government don't particularly look at this stuff and think it's a priority, when in truth it should be, because again, one of the things I've often discussed on the channel here is that video games are the next step in modern storytelling, right? We went from whether it's campfire stories to theater, novels, music, film, TV, and we're now at video games. And I think we need to sort of reframe how exactly we're looking at that. The corporations certainly have recognized it, which is why they've invested as much money as they have. And the ones who are jumping ship from Hollywood are trying to make the transition into video games, right? There's a reason they're doing this, because they recognize that this is an art form, and one that people are going to be interested in, because as humans we will always gravitate towards storytelling, and that's just never going to change. And so we need to be putting in place things to protect not only our stories but also the consumers as well. And so I think this is a very important conversation that is taking place. I just I do wish more people were involved or took an interest in it, but I think what Ross is doing is certainly a step in the right direction in getting that outcome, right? So let's check it out.
I am the founder of the Stop Killing Games consumer movement, which has many shared goals with the initiative. I'd like to clarify what it means to destroy a video game. The second slide. When we say a game has been destroyed, what we mean is a publisher has permanently disabled all copies of it that have been sold, so no one can ever play them again.
Yeah,
it would be like
huge
removing
problem
every single
in the
copy
industry.
of a book or film in existence, effectively erasing it from the culture. The way this practice works is, first, a publisher sells a copy of a video game. However, it has been designed so that it must connect to the publisher in order to function. This acts as a potential.
I love that Ross paused there, right? Because this is something that we've been discussing in the space for a long time now, and they try to hide behind the nouveau and as some sort of anti-piracy mechanic, right? But in truth, look, every industry suffers from piracy on some scale, right? Whether that is publishing, film or TV or music. But what you've recognized is that those industries have largely moved away from trying to implement any sort of technology to try to combat piracy. Instead, what they've done is make the content more affordable and easily accessed. Once you've managed to achieve those two things, investing money into trying to create anti-piracy technology and policy, it really is counterproductive, right? So at a certain point, it's not worth the investment that you'd have to make, and in truth, the people who do engage in piracy are a very, very small minority. That would not necessarily impact sales, to not to the extent in which a lot of these developers that would try to convince you it would be. It's really not, right? And so they add all these features to the games, always online features and all of that, which impacts not just the performance, but creates an avenue for more predatory practices, like microtransactions and stuff like that, and cash shops, that really don't need to be in there, particularly in single player games. But just by the mere fact, but by just having the back door there, we've just given them permission to add anything that they could possibly want under the guise of, protecting their product, which is just a facade.
Kill switch. The customer is also given no information when the game will stop working, even though the publisher has decided to assume that responsibility. Then, after an undisclosed length of time, the publisher disables all existing copies of the game, but keeps the customer.
I'm going to pause it again there, right? Because this sounds very familiar, right? I've spoken before about the some of the similarities that we're seeing with with film and TV crossing over into video games. And you've all noted, I'm sure, at the Game Awards that there's an increasing number of actors showing up, promotions for film and TV. So Hollywood is slowly bridging that gap and trying to make that transition into video games, for better or worse. I fear the worst of it. But one of the things that you do see happening in film and TV is where they're locking away content that they've deemed no longer necessary for public viewing, because, well, the real reason is because they don't want to pay residuals to actors or whatever other contractual obligations they may actually have. And so you'll see something similar happening with video games as well. We all remember the Nemesis system that WB Games has been holding on to for the longest while, and no one has been able to use the mechanic. And so this is something that is going to be happening time and time again, particularly as these companies consolidate. Because what is going to happen eventually is all these companies are going to begin to merge. We already see it happening again. Once that sale goes through with Warner Brothers Discovery and Paramount, it's going to be the first of many, right? Because we've seen it in the past with Disney, Fox, and so on. It's going to transition into video games as well eventually, and we're just going to be left with a handful of companies that own everything. That's something that we should be concerned about. But when that does happen, we're going to see the same practice where they're just locking stuff away, and gamers will no longer have access to it. So I'm glad he raised that point.
Also enacts countermeasures to ensure repairing the game. To ensure repairing the game is almost impossible, even for experienced software professionals. From this point onward, no customer can ever run the purchase again. Besides destroying the game, this practice is also subverting customer expectations. Most video games can work indefinitely, which has been the customer standard for half a century, including
not anymore once you migrate to fully digital.
A small number of video games operate as subscription services, but those inform the customer exactly when their access ends at the time of payment. The games we're referring to do no such thing. It's a bit of miscommunication. They almost always contain terms stating they can end at any time for any reason. What this means is customers have no real protections when they buy games like these. They are unable to keep them, and they are not informed when they will end. This behavior would be outrageous in other industries. If you bought a book in a store, the publisher cannot come into your home and take back your book at will. If you bought an insurance policy, you would be informed when that policy ends, not that the seller could end it at any time for any reason but still keep your money. The games being sold this way are operating similar to scams. Publishers know customers expect video games to last, so they sell these in the same way as.
And despite the fact that there's been a few changes in the past several months, GOG, and I think Steam to some extent, notifying customers, gamers that the copy of that they're actually purchasing is, effectively just just temporary and not giving them complete ownership of the product that they're actually buying. That's not enough. That just is not enough. You know, it's like putting a warning label on a cigarette package, but without actually putting regulation in place to prevent cigarettes from being sold to underage, customers. Right? There's just very little regulation happening with video games, and I know people tend to think of regulation as somewhat of a bad thing, but it is necessary to prevent these companies from taking advantage and exploiting customers. This is something that we're years behind when it comes to video games, because again, as I've said earlier on, for the government, this is just not something that is a priority. But I love that Ross made the parallel to novels, right? Because I think maybe that helps them to sort of conceptualize the issue a lot more, because that is one of the industries that is heavily regulated. That is heavily regulated, right? And even video, film and TV to some extent, in terms of who can watch what and the distribution of it and so on. But for video games, there's just so little that actually exists for the medium. It's unfortunate.
Ones that can work forever. As a one-time purchase with no expiry date, then price them the same. Publishers know that if customers were informed exactly when they plan to disable
Then they
their
wouldn't buy
games,
it.
that would reduce sales, since the longevity of a game affects how much customers are willing to pay. The industry is trying to have it both ways, finding ways to say they're selling you a game that they're not selling you. This creates confusion for everyone involved.
Or they're selling you a fraction of a game, right? Which seems to be the new norm now. Particularly games that are, they're manipulating early access now to do this very same thing. And now we have games that are in early access for months, some of them years. But yet still they have a price tag. We've gotten to the point now where we're paying developers to test their games for them. We're beta testers, only we are paying for the privilege of beta testing. And again, as I said, a lot of this happens because we've just allowed the developers this freedom, because gamers, a lot of them are naive. I'm sorry to say, but a lot of them are naive in terms of how the industry they think the industry works, and they think developers are their friends for some reason. But most developers, particularly the ones where the company has been taken public, you are no longer their priority. Their priority and their customers are now their shareholders. And yeah, I see this happening time and time again. And I place fault at the government for not regulating, and at the developers for participating in these predatory practices. But also I put some fault, I think some fault lies with the gamers as well, for not informing themselves, or for continuing to support some of these developers who continue to push these harmful practices. It begins and ends with the gamer. Things like always online wasn't necessary, but gamers allowed it. If gamers had pushed back on that, then we wouldn't be in the mess that we are in now.
And it's part of why it's taking customers so long to get exposure on this practice. The legality is also unsettled. Earlier, members of Parliament assisted us in asking questions to the EU Commission about how legal the terms and game license agreements were, especially being able to terminate them at any time for any reason. The Commission stated Directive 93/13 EEC prohibits unfair terms causing a significant imbalance in the parties' rights and obligations to the detriment of consumers. The Commission also recommended consumers file complaints with businesses across member states through the European Consumer Centers Network. In 2024, we had volunteers across the majority of EU countries submitting complaints against the French company Ubisoft for
This is the
disabling the game
challenge
The Crew.
because most
The
gamers are too
responses we
lazy
received from
to fill
the
out the paperwork
ECC
required to fix
network were
this thing.
extremely inconsistent. Some officials said there was nothing they could do. Others said the company was required to run the game indefinitely, which is unrealistic.
Yeah, that's
But
not
the
gonna happen.
majority stated there was no clear regulation on this practice. We were independently able to get thousands of complaints submitted to consumer agencies in France and Germany, but there still has been no decision on them on the legality either. To the best of our knowledge, no one in the EU has ever been compensated for this and hundreds of other titles. In short, governments in EU countries are not sure how to handle this situation, and customers are overwhelmingly not being compensated for the loss of their purchases. It is an ideal situation for clear regulation. This
I
is not a
agree.
new practice. It started approximately 2005 and began negatively impacting customers for them around 2010 onward. However, it often affects a minority of customers whose complaints can get lost in the system. It wasn't until a large case affecting millions that any attempts to get government attention were possible, and there still is no answer. The EU Commission says this must be handled on a case-by-case basis, but this practice is extremely widespread.
There has to be some sort of,
Future slides.
regulation put
We
in
informed
place.
an
It can't
amateur
be on
study
a case by
examining
case
over
basis. Not that
1,100 video
broadly.
games that require a connection to the publisher. The majority of these have been deliberately disabled by the publisher, with many of the rest still at risk of being destroyed.
4.6.
Under the strictest interpretation of what it means to disable a game, the study found that out of over 400 titles, publishers disable a customer's purchase 93.5% of the time when ending support. This business practice is responsible for more destruction to the medium than anything else by an enormous margin. There is also a strong correlation between this practice and the size of the publisher, as most small studios do not engage in it, as it requires far more resources.
Yeah, and why is that exactly? Right? These larger companies, they know that they can get away with it. That's I'm oversimplifying things, but a lot of these companies hold on to the brand, which is why a lot of the companies like Blizzard and so on, that where the people who built the company has long since left, and it's not a shell of what it used to be. But these companies buy the IP and the branding because they know that customers have attached their entire childhood to a lot of these brands, and they'll give them the benefit of the doubt even if the people who built the brand is no longer even with the company, and these larger corporations rely on that to manipulate customers. So they are more likely to engage in a lot of these, I still call it a predatory practices. They're more likely to engage in it because they have the ability to manipulate customers. Smaller indie developers don't, because they first have to build that goodwill with their consumers. And the unfortunate truth is, a lot of companies fall prey to the same outcome because they start out small in India and doing the right thing, and then as soon as they grow and become a large corporation, then they start to dabble in the same practice, right? We saw this happen with CDPR, who started out small and then had one of the most disastrous video game launches in history. Just a buggy, unpolished mess of a game, promising and under delivering and so on. And one that people seem to praise a lot, which is GGG, Grinding Gear Games. But man, I tried my first game from GGG with Path of Exile 2, and it was such a disappointment, because again, I already addressed the whole games being in early access for prolonged periods. Again, this is just more predatory practice that they're using to milk to get as much money as possible from it, so that they can launch it as free to air, which is not really free to air. It's just going to be a discounted title, right? By the time that comes out, most people who are interested in buying Path of Exile 2 have already paid for it, and then those people who are getting it for free will then pay for cosmetics, which go towards the price of the game. So it's really not free, right? So we've seen several examples of this, and I think gamers just need to be a bit more informed, and be realistic about what the what the objectives of these developers truly are.
Resources, work, and liability than they can handle. So even though this impacts a minority of games, it disproportionately affects customers due to the scale of the largest offenders. From sales figures, it impacts tens of millions of customers, minimum in the EU. This impacts developers as well. This may seem obvious, but based on interviews and feedback, we found the majority of game developers do not support having games they've worked on destroyed. They can spend years of their lives creating them.
The thing is, once
they
they leave the
often not
company,
ones
they
making
really
these
have
business
no say.
decisions, and sometimes even sign non-disclosure agreements so they cannot voice their opinion on the matter. The main point I hope that does not get lost in this hearing is this initiative welcomes any solution that will solve the problem of video games being destroyed on this scale. We want this to be as easy and as practical as possible for all parties involved, and are very open to how that is achieved. We are not even asking publishers to change their business or monetization models, only that
You
once
really
they
should,
end support, they do so in a responsible way. Our only goal is to prohibit this destructive practice and thus obtain basic protections for consumers and the medium as a whole. I'd like to add a little bit on the economic aspect. Again, when planned for from the beginning, the cost can be very small. It's mostly about when it's undoing that's more of a cost related. Earlier the game Concord was mentioned. That's actually an excellent example because it's publicly stated that,
Perfect example.
at least 370
Although
million
to be
euros
fair,
were spent
none of
developing
us want that game
and
to
it did
to
not
make.
include an end-of-life plan. Like
Yeah,
most,
none of us want that
most of the cost for
game to
developing
make a
games tends
return.
to come from other
It's
areas,
fine. They can cancel
hard
that one.
assets or marketing. This is just one element out of hundreds that already go into making a game. The other thing is sometimes industry costs or estimates of how much this would cost can be faulty because they're expecting the game they're asking for to have every last feature it did while it was being supported. Those can be retired and don't even make sense for a game that's no longer being supported, like administration or anti-cheat measures or account management or things like that. So that can drastically, there can be hundreds, or known as microservices, associated with these that can be disabled and the customer still has the core game. So that should be taken into account when figuring out the potential cost.
I mean, I think that speaks more towards online games, where maybe you can, allow people to set up a private server to continue playing the games. But this issue of, sometimes impacts single player games as well, particularly when there are games that require you to always be online to actually function and don't have an offline mode. So things like that really should be discussed as well. Every game, particularly if it's a single player game, really should have an offline mode. And even if it is online, I suppose depending on the type of game it is, even if it is online, it should still be possible to set up small servers to operate the game independently, if the game is being shut down.
It might have been mentioned earlier, but we also want to emphasize the companies have been paid already once for the working game, so that should be factored into the budgeting. There were some other points mentioned on the right to repair, whether we need it and how long a product should work. With right to repair, that's a little bit different issue. Well, that's certainly welcome, having the right to that. As I mentioned in my presentation, there are deliberate countermeasures to prevent repair. That it's almost like a small miracle when it does
looking
happen
at you,
from
Nintendo.
extremely experienced software professionals.
Looking at you, Nintendo. Yeah.
However, if there were repair instructions, that would be very welcome. I think we would even consider that a viable alternative to what we're asking if it was practical to resurrect the game that way. And for how long it should work, it's kind of again, the customer standard is indefinitely, as long as they keep the game in good working order.
Yeah, once they've paid for the game, they should have access to it.
Responsible for updates that break things that wasn't their doing. So how long they choose to support it, we're completely open to. I mean, I think there's already existing EU regulations on that, but I mean, as far as we're concerned, they could end support the next day, but as long as the game isn't destroyed, we would find that acceptable. And the
I don't
last
know.
point,
I'm not sure. There's the only real solution to this. Really, it's the more and more I hear may just be, to ensure that there's always physical copy sold with the game. And again, I know this is mostly, that solution would mostly only address this, single player stuff. The online games would, or multiplayer games might require uh, a bit more thought as to how to address that. Again, it comes down because the companies, to be fair, there may be some hesitation there because the game code would be considered a company property, and they won't necessarily want to share that if it is that it's an online game that requires a separate server to actually continue playing. So there is some, I can understand from to some extent the hesitation. So I do think when it comes to online games, it's not going to be a very straightforward solution, but there has to be one. Again, once the customer has paid you for the game, it should be something that they continually have access to. So there has to be a middle ground there somewhere.
uh, on the yeah, for doing this through the existing, just doing this through the courts, through the legal action, that still doesn't get to the heart of the matter of the game itself being destroyed. We're not really refunds and compensation. Those are a secondary measure that when the game itself can't be reinstated, we just want the game preserved. So doing it through the existing framework doesn't quite get us there necessarily.
All right. So now he mentioned a refund there. Yeah, they would never agree to that one. Never agree to that one. But well done to Ross on his presentation there. I don't think this couldn't have been easy, and I'm sure it has thrown his entire life into turmoil just getting to this point, right? And it does feel as though the work has only just now started, despite the progress that he's made over the past few years now. So yeah, kudos to him, right? At least someone is doing it. I'm glad to see that someone is actually doing it, and I hope a lot of gamers look at this and recognize that they need to be a bit more proactive in trying to protect, the games that they say they hold dear. And if you do, you need to take a more active stance on how to protect it, right? So well done to Ross. Again, this is gonna be something that we're gonna be talking about for some time, and I will say I do not expect any resolution from the US, so I think it will have to come from outside. And people meme the European Union and the EU for a lot of their stance, but we have to give credit where credit is due. When it comes to consumer protections, they're way above the United States, right? He mentioned right to repair there at the end, and that's something that they've been very forthcoming about, and not just with video games, but with phones as well. And standardizing USB-C connection for electronic devices, so that we're not stuck paying Apple this exorbitant fee for their ridiculous lightning cable. So the EU has been integral in securing a lot of consumer protections, and if this does go through or make some progress, then this is just another W for them, really, right? Again, if you're a gamer, the US, a lot of gamers in the US, you need to be doing something similar to get action in the US as well, right? We cannot keep relying on the EU to get us there, or just Ross on his own, right? There needs to be a movement in the US towards this as well. We talk a lot about how much gaming means to us, but no one is taking that initiative to actually get something, to get the ball moving on this subject in the US. In terms of solutions, again, there's no real easy solution there, and I don't think there's going to be a one fit all solution. I don't think there will be, but we do need to return to certain common sense practices. I think physical copies is something that we do need to get back to, but maybe we'll need to sort of revisit whether that is in this format, but whatever format it takes, I do think we need to get back to physical. Digital is leading us in the wrong direction, so I think that is one potential solution. The other is it should be mandatory that if it's a single player game, it should not require you to be always online. That should not be possible, right? So there are some common sense practices that we can do and government should enforce to ensure that these developers are not trying to exploit gamers, right? Because again, one of the only reasons why they push for this always online function is so that they can sell you something, right? And particularly when we're talking about young kids, they want to be able to bombard them with they turn them into gambling addicts effectively, right? So those are some of the first steps that we can actually take to address some of those issues. When we get to the online games, that is where it gets a bit more complicated. Again, from the legal frameworks are just a bit too complicated when it comes to IPs and ownership and what these companies can actually share in order to have gamers maintain a server to continue playing those games. It gets a bit tricky there. I think I don't know, there may have to be a situation where if the game is going to be going offline, that the customer is reimbursed in part, right? Not completely, but in part for the game. In my mind, I just don't see a clear solution there. At least not one that these developers will or these corporations would actually agree to, because it may involve them sharing game code, which they may not want to or be able to even. So I do think we may be looking at something like a partial refund if it's an online game, and you're losing that component of it. But I also think in the development process, they should simultaneously work toward some sort of feature where the game isn't completely shut down. If it's off, if it's offline, it should still be functioning in some capacity, right? So I do think we need to revisit how online games as a whole, how that development process takes place, because we should have the consumer in mind when developing that part of the game as well. Yeah, so again, I think these conversations are going to continue, but I applaud Ross for all the work that he's done so far, and we will continue tracking this story, and as more updates are, as we receive more updates, I'll probably have other videos to continue that discussion. All right, thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you for the next one.